Hi, everybody. Welcome to Stanford Law School for this event on the role of lawyers in crisis communications. My name is Lucy Rica. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on the Legal Profession here at the Law School. First of all, I'd like to thank the Rock Center for Corporate Governance for co-sponsoring this event with us, and Dan Siciliano for moderating. And I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll take it away. On the far right, we have Lanny Davis, who is known well, I'm sure, to most of you. He's a Yale-educated lawyer, crisis management consultant, author, TV commentator, who provides strategic counsel to clients under public or governmental scrutiny. He's often the public face of such persons or companies, appearing before the media on their behalf. He is currently the principal at Lanny J. Davis & Associates and an executive vice president at the PR firm Levick. During the Clinton administration, Lanny served as special counsel to President Clinton and was the spokesperson for the Clintons in the White House during various investigations. Before that, he had an extensive legal practice in Washington. In the middle here, we have Walter Montgomery. Walter is a co-founder of Robinson Lehrer Montgomery, which is now known as Finsbury. It's one of the top global communications firms, and he served as the CEO for 14 years. Walter has overseen the communication strategy for some of the most well-known corporate crises of the past 20 years, including Tyco, Citigroup, and Nielsen's battle against Rupert Murdoch and Fox News. Right here we have Lin-Hua Wu. Lin-Hua is a graduate of this law school, and after practicing for a short time, she moved into the corporate communications and crisis management field. She's worked with Bay Area companies during her time at Kexton Company and at the Brunswick Group, two well-known communications firms, and she recently joined Square as head of corporate communications. And finally, Nigel Glennie. Nigel has been in corporate communications for 20 years, focusing on public relations and crisis communications. He is currently the director of global corporate communications at Cisco and leads a team responsible for corporate PR and business critical communications. So again, thank you all for coming. We'll, when we turn it over to question and answer, I would just ask that you come to the two standing mics for any questions so that we can pick it up on the recording. And I'll turn it to Dan.
Great. Thanks very much, Lucy. Well, we're really happy to be here. My first question to Lucy was, so what qualifies me for moderating a panel on crises? And she kind of looked at me slowly and said, I see, crises. Law schools aren't immune from their share of crises and scandal, but I think the ones we're going to be using as examples are going to be a little bit more interesting in part. The title, Getting Ahead of Scandal, I think is almost a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that you're running the whole time a crisis is happening. And we're going to tease out some best practices, some thoughts about what works and what doesn't, and in particular, this sort of clash, and I might put it too strongly, and I'll be corrected as we discuss it, between the lawyerly mindset, the communications mindset, and then the management mindset. And we'll see if we can't reconcile that and walk a fine path of harmony between those different categories of folks. So I think we just want to start off, perhaps, with a little bit of definition to give us all kind of the same script to work from. And I might turn to Walter maybe to volunteer a little bit about, a description of what we mean in the corporate or the political context when we say crisis, and in particular, what do we mean when we say crisis management, once we've defined that?
Well, I can speak to the corporate, not so much the political. And to me, it's an overused term, much overused term, but it, at least in my experience, has meant something that threatens the viability of an organization, threatens its business, can drive its share price down. In many cases, it's been an existential crisis where a company's actual existence was at stake because of some issue, some scandal that arose. And your job is basically to try to manage through it, minimize the damage, and rebuild the reputation of the organization. And I do think that people should approach a situation like that primarily as an opportunity rather than a defeatist mode, because if you manage through it successfully, you actually burnish the reputation of your organization and your leadership as a CEO.
And maybe I'll turn to Lanny to expand, because you've straddled both the political side, the political and personal maybe, and certainly the business. Can you maybe give us a little bit more sense of the definition and maybe what's involved in crisis management itself?
Well, the most recent example occurred yesterday at San Francisco Airport when I conducted a conference call, got here leaving on the 6:30 plane from Washington so I could be situated in a place where I could participate in a conference call. This involved what is called in the legal business, in the business world, as a short attack, which is people who sell short in a stock market situation are betting that the share price will go down, and the more it goes down, the more money they make. So there is an incentive for people who are selling short for there to be bad news in the media that shakes the confidence of the stock market and therefore causes people to sell. And then more people go short and more people sell, and it's a downward cycle, and everybody makes a lot of money as the stock goes down. So I was retained, and the existential threat was that people were believing an anonymous blog that said very nasty things about the company. So that's an existential threat. The way to defeat that threat, or any other threat, but certainly a short-selling threat, is facts, 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 turn the lights on, and challenge the short seller to come out of the darkness and be accountable for what I stated were distortions. So there is a general theme that in the middle of an existential crisis, whether it is a short attack or reputational injury or something that really is betting the farm on personal reputation or scandal, that the more facts that you can get out, even if they're bad, but they're able to put the matter to rest, fix the problem, and move on, is the ultimate solution we all know so well.
So I might turn to maybe Lin-Hua and Nigel a little bit. So from the in-house corporate side, there are components you have to address that aren't just communication, maybe they're regulatory, maybe they're litigation or pre-litigation. Can maybe we start with Lin-Hua? Can you expand on maybe some of the the boxes you start looking at as these things evolve?
Well, I think as an in-house communications person, you obviously have to think about how this affects your internal stakeholders, right? So the employee base. They obviously read the news, they speak, and you want to make sure that it's business as usual and that everyone's focusing on getting the job done, the important day-to-day job. So there will be an internal communications component, obviously. And I think that, especially in Silicon Valley, transparency is in tech companies is very, very valued, and there is an expectation by a lot of the millennials who work at these tech companies that they work for a company that's not only mission driven and has leadership that they admire, but that they will be spoken to and communicated with as things happen. Obviously, for legal reasons, sometimes that's not always a possibility. So that's
come to that.
Yeah. So that's one other step. I'll let Nigel maybe add on to that.
I think Walter's early point is a really good one, that perspective is important. If you're a marketing person and you see 100 tweets an hour on something, you think that's a crisis. But if you're in safety and security and somebody's life and limb, or there's been a kidnapping of one of your executives, that's a very different conversation. And then there's the existential threat, perhaps, of a corporate reputation issue that is something that will impact share prices and company viability, products and confidence in your products, and can really strike at the core of a company. So that perspective of who you are and what it is very important.
Well, can I ask something about facts? It's very important in crisis management to indeed make sure you have the facts and not leap to conclusions and think you have the facts or trot facts out because if you want to put something behind you as fast as you can or sweep an issue under the rug. And you got to make sure before you talk that you really know what the situation is to the best of your ability possible. And I think what's happening with Volkswagen right now is an example of what can transpire if you don't get the facts nailed down and get your story nailed down more accurately. It could come back to haunt you badly. There are many other examples, too.
In fact, I think we're going to come back to that a few times, and I might, Lin-Hua, in just a second have you expand on it as part of the answer to the question of what's changed in the last 10 years, because maybe there's a little bit of capacity for third parties to chase new facts, to expose them. The cycles may be tighter. But let me just summarize what we kind of threw out there. It feels like a crisis is something that is either extraordinarily pointed and really moves the needle, and or an existential threat to the enterprise, to situation, and it has both internal and external stakeholders and constituencies. So it's not just the shareholders, perhaps. It can be the employees, it can be regulators, it can be shareholders, it can be all of the above. And then there's at least 4 parts to the response. There's government, there's kind of raw communications, there's litigation preparation, and then arguably there's internal information flow, getting your facts right. So I think we understand the elements of it. We'll spell it out a bit more, but can you, Lin-Hua, start by telling us what you think has changed the most in that both definition, the response strategies, the landscape, maybe in the last 10 years?
Sure. And I think one important stakeholder, if you are a consumer-facing company or a consumer-facing brand, obviously, the general public is a huge stakeholder. And I think what I'm about to say is pretty obvious, but with the changing landscape of the media and the way social media has really taken on breaking news, so Twitter, Facebook, different blogs, everyone is now a media person, right? So a normal lay person can have a huge audience and have a blog and tweet a lot and have a huge following and can break news, and people think of that as sort of newsworthy in a way that I think 10 years or more ago there were different journalistic standards. I think the international aspect as well, and just the fast pace of the media. So something starts in China and it gets translated very easily, and it starts a wave of media here. So everything's very, very instantaneous. And I think that from a communications person's perspective, what is the most difficult, one of the biggest challenges, is dealing with a lot of, for example, tech bloggers or news websites. Not to pick on anyone, for example, Pando Daily, that has a different kind of audience and a different kind of person who writes for Pando Daily. And I actually, I like reading it because it's amusing, but it's a different kind of. It could be snarky, sarcastic, and very amusing to read, but that obviously is a different animal for a corporate communications person to deal with. And before, 10 years ago, if you didn't agree with something, you thought there was a factual error, you could ask the journalist, and you could ask for a correction, and you could explain yourself, and then you could go to that person's editor if that wasn't, if they weren't being responsive and felt like you would have a shot. If this person is an individual blogger, they're not required to tell a balanced story or even to be accurate. So it's obviously more challenging for that reason.
In fact, sometimes those bloggers want you to come up with something because they can then write again the next day and get more focus on that.
And the last thing I'll say on this is just, Twitter is something where I think every communications person, like my tweet deck is up all day long and I get Twitter alerts, and that is where, at least in Silicon Valley in the tech world, where news breaks almost all the time. And journalists put all of their articles first up on Twitter, on their personal Twitter account. And there's conversations and arguments and debates that happen on Twitter all the time between journalists, between lay people and journalists, between companies and journalists. And so you really have to be aware of what's happening there, and it spreads, and people pick up things from Twitter, and then they report on them, and they publish it in Fortune and Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. So it's really a fast moving animal now.
And Nigel, I might want you to expand on that as well, especially from someone who works at a company where, recently not a scandal, but just the visibility of it. You have a new CEO. He filled a sports stadium. He was up on a jumbotron. I mean, there were, I assume, thousands and thousands of tweets simultaneously. I mean, there's just so much visibility in your universe. How does that, maybe expand on what Lin-Hua said and tie that to crisis management?
I think to use that example in particular, we actually had an internal communication strategy that was focused on using our employees to amplify the excitement of the event. We had a transition from a Silicon Valley icon who'd been a CEO with us for decades to somebody who was well known in certain parts of the world and certain parts of the market, but wasn't as well known clearly as John Chambers was. And part of that, our employees knew who he was. We knew our employees were excited by the fact that he was chosen. So we actively encouraged our employees to be spokespeople in that environment. And one of the things that I think came through very strongly in the media strategy was that there was their tweets, their hashtags were actually used and reported publicly as well. So we considered that a success. I wanted to circle back, though, if I could, on one topic, and that was what's changed. And I think that the question is one of trust. To what extent do anybody in this room actually think that they trust what they see and read in the paper, or trust a corporate statement from a company? And that these days, I think people will take that as one point of information and then see what else they can find. And I've heard it said once that if you read something online and then you go and see two of your friends have posted it on Facebook, then you know that it's true. And that's the current standard sometimes for some news.
maybe I'll lean over and ask maybe Lanny to jump in on this, a narrow piece of this, and that is, in terms of the media and the press, what is the biggest challenge posed by the contemporary media in your experience, maybe recently, to getting your job done or doing your job well? Maybe it's the same answer, I don't know, but I'm curious as to exactly what you've experienced.
Well, having had a client whose reputation was being attacked by Pando Daily and having to deal with the editor and founder of Pando Daily on the telephone was akin to root canal without a Novocaine. And I discovered, not for the first time, that people that don't use the journalistic standards that are old-fashioned, which is you don't go with a fact unless it's confirmed, and you don't put something up on Twitter unless you believe it to be confirmed, and then the social media amplification of the misinformation turns, as the trite expression goes, viral. And then the real question is, how do you beat it? And then how do you beat, I'll use the name as a noun or a verb, we all do. How do you beat the Googleization of misinformation? If you Google a viral Twitter misstatement of fact and you get 1 million hits, most people, certainly in the millennial and younger generation, I have a 17-year-old and a 10-year-old, so I can speak with older children and younger children, will simply say it must be true if I got 1 million hits. So what do you do to defeat that? And I don't have a simple answer, and I won't go on much further because I like to hear from my colleagues. But that's the biggest challenge. Because of the multiplication into millions of the repetition of a falsehood, or worse than a falsehood, which you can at least try to correct with a fact, is an innuendo viral message, where there's no real assertion, it's simply an innuendo of wrongdoing. That's the biggest challenge of the internet. Now, I have some lessons learned doing it the wrong way and the right way, some of which I learned with Pando Daily. But I'll give you one word.
I'm glad we're copacetic on that.
I'll give you one word and really would invite my panelists and those of you out there who have both been victimized by believing what you read on Twitter and social media because it's 1 million times it must be right, or you've been assisted because you get your information right away and you don't have to wait for the filter of the media. And my question is embarrassment. The only tool I had in my battle with, I won't name the lady who's the head of Pando Daily, was professional embarrassment. And I asked my fellow, meaning you got it wrong, and I'm going to call you out in mainstream media, and your investors and everybody that follows you is going to know that you got it wrong, just factually wrong. And I must say that she reacted to that. She first said, no, I didn't. Then she said, well, maybe we did. And then finally, we got her to move. But that's rare. So share with me your experience in combating a viral misinformation that gets Googled all over the place.
Yeah, whoever wants to jump in, I think that's great.
Well, I'm learning that I need to call Lanny if I have a concern with a particular group. No. One of the challenges we often have in this sort of conversation is when and how to engage.
Right.
If there is something that is going on, is it better to leave it alone or draw attention to it? And some of the folks at this table certainly, and many of you might know of the Streisand effect. If you haven't heard of that one, definitely look it up. It's where Barbara Streisand tried to take something off the internet, and it actually created more attention because of that, and more people knew about it when something she was trying to hide. The fact that I'm on a panel now talking about it and we're being recorded means that strategy continues to not work for her. So I think, though, that there is a balance, particularly when, and this is something that we see in many of the lawyers that I work with as well, there's an inherent sense of justice. They know that if I just make a strong argument and I make my case, it'll be right. And sometimes the public relations person at the table is the one saying to them, yes, but here's the damage that will be caused if you try doing that. So there is actually a situation where you have a communications person and a lawyer together looking to provide an argument, looking to provide advice, and the subject or the client sometimes has to make a call based on the type of advice that's coming through.
So I'd love you to expand on that. You're the honorary non-lawyer at the table,
Yes.
And then I think we're going to turn to Walter. So what can you give us an example of where there's tension versus where there's cooperation? Is there some secret sauce that enables the cooperation versus the tension? And then we'll have Walter expand.
I work at a company that is great. We've got lawyers who are fantastic, and I'm glad we're recording this because they may be watching it. They are folks that see their role as advisors to the business. And when a business leader says, what do you think? The people around the table, and there's equal weight given to those, and everybody understands. Our lawyers at Cisco in particular are focused on to what extent might this play out in other areas. That doesn't mean we don't still have some conflict. But I think the traditional perspective, the traditional relationship is one where the lawyer will stop you from saying anything, and the public relations person wants to say too much. And somewhere in the middle there is probably the right answer.
Walter, do you want to expand?
Well, I think in crisis, we're talking about the lawyer.
The lawyer versus communications department.
Yeah.
You're in the middle of the crisis.
We go for and, not versus, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, it's overplayed, at least today. But I think that's largely because I've been mostly a consultant working with a wide variety of companies and many different companies. And usually in those situations, you're working with an outside lawyer who has been through a crisis, probably many crises, and therefore understands the importance of communication. So I haven't run into that problem a lot. The major problems, I don't want to stereotype people too much, but usually the problems with lawyers arise when you're dealing with lawyers who are in-house lawyers who have not had that kind of experience. They're much more conservative, much more uptight about what is said. Indeed, some of the lawyers I've worked with are terrific PR machines in their own right, and not necessarily just for their own interest, but for the client's interest. And one of the ways in which I've used them is as spokespersons, because they tend to know the legal niceties of the issues that are at stake. And often I've got them talking off the record or on background to reporters if they can't talk actually on the record. And they're incredibly valuable because they have more credibility, frankly, than the average public relations person or communications person. And they do know the niceties of the situation. Can I just go back for a second to what's changed? Because I'm so old, I've actually seen a lot of change.
Okay, very good. No, please.
It's a lot more complex today, a lot more chaotic. There's a lot more noise, but it's a lot more interesting intellectually too. And by the way, in the midst of all that sort of chaos out there, one of the jobs for people like me, us, is to try to put things in perspective, to act as a filter as to what's important or not important. And often in a crisis situation, you've got a CEO who is usually the key person in a company in a crisis situation, the pivotal individual for good reason. But often you find a CEO who wants to overreact to the latest thing appearing on a blog or coming across television or whatever. Part of your job as a crisis manager is to put things in perspective and push back and say, look, calm down, take the longer term view on this, and here's why this is not important. Here's why this blog is not important, or that social medium is not important. Along with this, by the way, also there's a need for constant monitoring of the social media and filtering out what's important and not important. And often it's 24/7 because you've got a much more global environment. And compared to 15, 20 years ago, you now have more international markets of great import involved in a crisis situation, China in particular. And in the midst of all this, to get your job done, you have to also be much more precise in how you target your audiences. You have to make a much more targeted effort at reaching the influencers in various constituencies, the press, political leaders, community leaders, even among your employees who are the leaders. You have to be very precise in order to cut through all the nonsense, and much more precise in shaping your messages, much more sophisticated in shaping them and delivering them, which, by the way, opens up the need, I think, for more use of behavioral economics and neuroscience and corporate communications, whatever the caveats about those fields, especially neuroscience, might be. And I think the field of corporate communications has been a laggard in developing more sophisticated techniques for messaging and targeting. Anyway.
Walter, I can't tell you how happy you've made me by using the phrases, neuroscience and behavioral economics in a panel of mine. For those who are my students, they'll know. Like, yes.
Did you pay him?
That's right. That was a paid endorsement, and now on videotape too. So that's great. I want to maybe turn to Lin-Hua and say, as the one in-house corporate lawyer in this story, how have you navigated, or how have you watched others navigate this balance that creates a cooperative environment with communications?
So I agree what Walter said, because I spent most of my life as an outside agency consultant, and what you said resonated with me a lot, because when it comes to a big legal, economic, financial crisis at a company, typically the outside counsel will be brought in and really does a lot of running of it. And the outside PR people will work very closely with outside counsel, and since they've been through it many times, they've often really understood the importance of public relations, and yes, serve as spokespeople, do a lot of backgrounding behind the scenes, have a lot of credibility. I think, the in-house lawyers, it really just, it depends on the company and the culture and who you get, obviously. And I think the more experienced, general counsels do understand, and what they do have that outside counsel doesn't have is they understand the business. And they understand that their job is to support the business. So sometimes I think the tension between communications and legal will be, this is the right thing, the most conservative thing to do, perhaps from a legal point of view. But we also have to make the business decision about making sure that the business moves forward. And as a PR person, our job is to really assess the situation and give our best advice, considering both of those. And so I feel like if you have the in-house lawyer who obviously understands the company and has business objectives, they will be good at understanding that this is important for the business. So I just argued against myself and what you said, but I feel like, if you have a general counsel who really understands the business and is part of the inner circle, and maybe that's a big difference, is we all know there are general counsels who have a seat at the table, work very closely with the CEO, and there are other general counsels who are more service providers, even within the company. And if you get one who has a seat at the table, who is a senior leader at the company, I think they'll really understand that the business objectives have to be, paramount, and we have to think about how the legal and the PR fits in.
Can I ask? I want to ask a narrow kind of technical legal question, and I think, Lanny, you'll be the best one to answer this, but I'm not sure. Feel free to jump in. I often hear conversations along the lines of, wait, careful, we'll blow privilege if we craft that press release, or we'll run into problems if we apologize in this way because it invokes this thing. So can you talk a little bit about navigating the contours of things like privilege? I mean, that sometimes that's really important to preserve.
I think that somebody told you to ask me that question. Thank you. So the biggest problem I've had with my fellow lawyers is this question. And with all due respect, Walter has been spoiled, so don't pay any attention to his experience with lawyers, because he happened to work with the finest lawyer, maybe better than me.
Can we'll write that down?
Who knows the law and knows the media and knows how to make both work. And his name is David Boies. So when he says lawyers get it and I make them spokesman, and I say, come on, Walter, David Boies, it's sort of like maybe as an exception. So the real problem is that lawyers are focused in a silo concentration, which I share and understand their concern, that by talking to the media, you're going to be waiving, quote, privilege. They don't even really define what that means, other than if there's any risk, don't talk to the media. Well, I wrote a book about my experience in the White House, and I called it The Lawyer's Zero Risk Rule. If there's any risk at all of affecting attorney-client privilege, which means that what a client says to me, I can never be subpoenaed to testify, nor can the client ever be subpoenaed to testify on what I said to the client. It's as sacrosanct as confessing for somebody in a booth with a priest. Yet, lawyers will raise the flag of privilege, and since only other lawyers are going to be able to deal with that flag, the CEO gets very psyched and concerned, because the lawyer will talk about all the potential dangers of our conversations being revealed to the plaintiff's lawyer or to the prosecutor. And the only person in the room that can challenge the zero risk rule is another lawyer. So the point of what I wrote in my experience at the White House and since is that it's up to a lawyer like David Boies, like the lawyers you were lucky enough to have dealt with, and Lynn, you'll certainly agree, to make the argument that getting the facts out will not affect attorney-client privilege, and have a case which I happen to carry in my pocket when I'm with lawyers, that Judge Lewis Kaplan decided in 2003 that involved a Martha Stewart, a public relations firm, in which finally a federal district court judge said the rendering of legal advice includes media strategy, full stop. And no other judge or circuit court, much less the Supreme Court, has overruled that statement, which is so obvious to everybody who can add two and two. But you still have to have that argument with fellow lawyers. And even if you lose the argument and you don't get the media strategy because the lawyers are too concerned about privilege or getting it wrong and hurting your case, having the argument from one lawyer to another lawyer, the tension is very helpful. And if there isn't an argument, and lawyers tend to dominate in the middle of crises because the CEO won't second guess the big law firm, the board of directors is scared of shareholder cases, the lawyers tend to run the company during a big crisis. You've got to have a lawyer in the room to engage in the debate.
I think this is actually a good segue to the question around apologies. And I'm going to turn to Nigel around this, right? So a specific subset of this discussion often arises around the issue of should there be an apology made, who should make it. So the interesting part is it's not just legal, though. It's reputational. There's a lot of credibility issues. There's some complex issues about reaction and whether people meet. So that whole bundle gets talked about. And yet I have seen companies stall and hold off because they're afraid about what kind of admission comes with that. So can you give us the rundown of the apology versus not apology, your experience? Sure. How does that work?
So the timing of the apology is incredibly important. Who gives the apology is very important, and what they say is very important. Now, all of these seem to be from a communications perspective, but if you're a large global energy company and there is an oil spill at the bottom of the Gulf, there is 87 days of oil spilling out, and you're giving the apology on screen as that's occurring, it has less effect from somebody who doesn't have the ability to try and change that. So while victims are still being created, while the situation is still ongoing, the apology is nice, but what are you going to do about it becomes the next conversation. The right person to apologise is important. If you have a community-based issue, somebody who is known in that community and is aware of what's going on, who has credibility with the people, the audiences you're speaking to, is important. If you bring the CEO out for everything and he or she is apologising on every occasion, the credibility of that apology is difficult. So it is a case-by-case situation. There are a variety of things to think of, and source credibility is absolutely one of those.
And there's a culture in Silicon Valley about kind of, invincibility, founder-led certainty. There's a lot that is maybe unique. I'll have you tell us about the Silicon Valley ethic around both acknowledging being incorrect versus forging ahead and saying, I'll be proven right eventually. Does that factor into this apology, question, or is it a separate thing?
I think that the Silicon Valley is a place that forgives people's mistakes. There are entrepreneurs and many stories of failed entrepreneurs that try and try again, and they're not embarrassed about it, and I think that's generally a good thing. So I do think there are examples of CEOs who've gotten themselves into scandals, leaders, young, sexual harassment or abuse, things like that. A slew of them recently, I feel last year, where they've issued apologies and it's worked. I mean, I think that everything Nigel said is important about timing, about the person. I think tone and tenor is incredibly important. I think people are smart and intuitive and understand that if something is sincere, comes off as sincere, and the words have to be very, very precise and correct. A half apology or an insincere apology doesn't go a long way. So I do think that generally in a crisis, in order to overcome and move on, when there has been wrongdoing or there's something negligent that has happened, even if it doesn't rise to the legal sort of definition, that if your consumers, if your stakeholders believe that something could have been better, a sincere apology of course, lawyers would argue and don't want this to happen, but that's the best way to move on if you do it at the right time. And then I think you have to really work with the lawyers, because there are cases where I'm sure an admittance, apology sounds like an admittance of guilt, and you just have to be careful. But I think there's ways to do it that sound sincere and that actually make stakeholders believe that you really regret that.
Can I give an example that maybe, and I don't think we have any conflicts, but say so if you can't address it. So, Uber not too long ago, was caught data mining and kind of profiling, and in a way, the way the news played it, sort of making fun of, users in certain circumstances. And it felt like there was a bit of a lag, but then there was an apology. So that was an interesting treatment, and it had a lot of these elements. Do you have any insights into that? Was that handled well? Do you think it was the lawyers who said, wait, don't stand up and say we data mined in a way that violated our own terms of service, or maybe that wasn't what caused it?
I personally don't have any insights into it, but there are always talking heads on TV willing to express an opinion about something. And I am always willing to give the spokesperson or the company the benefit of the doubt, because that's where I come from. And quite often there's somebody inside the company who has seen all of the facts, knows what's going on, and has decided this is the best approach for us. We're going to choose this time and this type of approach. So I'm willing to make an assumption of a good strategic decision in terms of a delay on an apology as other things are being sorted, or it might just be that they're bad. Both those things could be possible, or somewhere in between. But I think I'm always hesitant to second guess somebody else's strategy because I don't have the facts.
A piece of that, and maybe Walter, I'm going to ask you to tease this out a little bit because it expands on your idea of what marks a smart lawyer in this context. So a piece of that in Silicon Valley, at least, and I don't mean to harp on this, but I think it's a theme, is the apology that says, listen, I'm young, I'm inexperienced, I'm overeager, I just want to get stuff done, I'm trying to change the world in a hurry, every once in a while we really screw up, forgive me. And it seems to play well, it seems to work well. It seems that that's a really difficult thing for a lawyer to stamp an okay on, right? Where someone stands up and says, especially if you think about it from a corporate governance viewpoint, which is a securities regulatory viewpoint. I mean, this is a dangerous admission when a CEO stands up and says, yeah, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm doing my best. Anyone can comment, but Walter, I know you've worked with a variety of lawyers who, according to Lanny, are really good at getting the whole, you got to run with something clever.
Yeah, not all of them were, but,
okay.
but quite a few. The problem with the apology is, I think it's really hard to make recommendations about what's going to fit all situations. I mean, I think an apology is not always appropriate, obviously, but it does need to be made. And as Lin-Hua said, it has to have a sense of empathy. There has to be, as Nigel said, follow-on substantive action, or it's going to come back to haunt you. But you also have to know what you're apologizing for. And I come back to the Volkswagen example, because there was an apology. But now we need another apology, maybe a third apology, right? And so you have to be very careful what you're apologizing for in the final analysis. And yeah, the lawyers can be a real obstacle to that. But I also, again, maybe because of certain lawyers I've worked with, they understand that at some point you need to. This is part of the process of redemption, carefully worded.
So next week at the Stanford, we're hosting a day on cyber security, and part of the exercise that we're doing at the end of the day is what we call a tabletop exercise, and we're putting people in groups, and then we're handing them a fact situation, and then every 5 minutes we're throwing new stuff at them. So it's going to be kind
friends for about 2 hours.
Yeah, and it's going to be frenzied, right? It's going to be stressful because they learn new things as it goes along. This seems to map to a typical crisis pattern, which is you think you know some things. You learn new things, you get new players, it just kind of keeps evolving. So there is this concept of a legal crisis manager, and Lanny, I'm turning to you on this. It's described as a role, it's described as a role that you've taken on. Can you talk to us about, is that a role where you show up with a client and say, I'm going to play the legal crisis manager and it's defined, or is it something that people are observing what you're doing and naming it, and if so, what are the key elements of it? I mean, does it calm the chaos, or is it something you've done?
The simple, and maybe try to answer for everyone at this table who's so good at this discipline, is everyone's got to be at the table. And it's okay if there are lots of debates, but I've been more, maybe I've just had some bad experiences, Walter, in the worst type of environment, where everyone is in a silo. The PR people are trying to put out press releases that are filled with rhetoric and no facts, because the facts are struck by the lawyers who don't want to say anything other than rhetoric. Then you have the lawyers who are focused on the litigation. You have the business people who are watching the share values, especially the investor relations people. And they're all in silos, and the poor CEO is afraid that he's going to get it wrong because the board's going to be upset, the shareholders are going to be upset. So getting everybody in the same room and developing a common strategy, especially between the tension, there are three tensions: public relations versus legal, healthy, needs to happen, needs to be engagement, reaction, whether you're doing the Barbra Streisand mistake and whether it's better to leave it alone and see if it goes away, versus my inclination always is it's not going to go away unless we kill it with facts. But sometimes it's the Streisand effect, so that's a tension. But the one that I have the most difficulty with, because I'm a great believer, is the riskiest one, which is you have bad facts that you know that the press doesn't know, that the shareholders don't know. And you call a reporter and give the reporter the bad story and get it out. Then it's easier to do the apology, and we're going to fix it. I do not believe in apologies, unless exactly as Nigel said, there's a fix that follows the sentence. I'm sorry that we screwed this up. By the way, a Washington definition of apology is, I'm sorry if I insulted you.
Yeah. Sorry you feel that way.
Not a real one.
No, it's an if. I'm sorry, but. I'm sorry if. No, I'm sorry, stop. No ifs, no buts. I'm sorry. But then, and this is how I'm going to fix it. If you don't say this is how I'm going to fix it, and then actually fix it and follow through, who cares about the apology? But I think the placement of a proactive negative story that gets all your facts out, includes what went wrong and how you're going to fix it before the story breaks, is very risky. And lawyers are almost always against doing it, and it's almost always effective. So put that together.
Well, I want to draw some comments on that. Like just the phrase "proactive negative story," that sends a chill down my back.
Exactly.
Like, So, what are your views on this? I think it's interesting.
I've definitely done that before, and I'm thinking of one case in particular where we knew bad facts about a leader of a company, personal bad facts, potentially criminal, but a long time ago, and sort of a proactive effort was taken. And it was the best thing to do because you get it out there. Statute of limitation had passed, so that was obviously helpful.
Well, that's always
yes,
good.
That's
There we are. There won't be a perp walk,
exactly,
in other words.
yeah.
Okay.
But yeah.
You know you're in trouble when that's your good news.
But, good news is, but I think it's obviously risky because you think, well, maybe it'll never happen, but then you live in fear and you are caught flat-footed, and if you find a reporter who you think can understand, take a more empathetic approach, the rehabilitation has been done, like you can offer the solutions that have been done, then you get that out of the way and you can move on and apologize with sincerity. So it is definitely risky, and lawyers don't always like it, but it can often be extremely successful.
And I think it speaks to the skills that a solid crisis operator has, be it legal or communications, that the best operators tend to be those who understand scenarios, have seen a little bit of it before, can plan what's going to happen and can predict where things will go. And when that happens, you can predict the example of a proactive negative story, and this is how it will play out, and here's how the media will be, and here's who will chime in on day 2, and here's what day 3 and day 4 and maybe not day 5 will look like, where a year of not knowing and then it breaking in this way with none of the facts and no ability for our voice to be there. Here's how that will play out.
And you can also get third-party advocates, right? So if you control it, it also it doesn't mean just speaking with a reporter, but it means preparing your internal communications. It means galvanizing third parties who may be willing to say publicly good things, right? It means proactively communicating so you get to tell it your way and get those facts out.
So in our preparation conversations, I can't remember who raised it, but everyone agreed about this idea of getting ahead of the scandal by preparing for contingencies that had not yet manifested. How do you do that practically? I mean, it's so all-consuming to just be dealing with the crisis as it's there. How do you start talking about the iterations that might be days away when maybe your CEO can barely keep standing with what's happening today?
Walter.
Well,
All yours.
start with Walt.
That's a hard one. You can have that.
We voted. You go.
It is hard, and it's harder in a world that moves as fast as this one does today, and is as complicated with as many media. But and there's no perfect solution. But the best way, well, one key element of it, I won't say this is the only thing, but one key element is feedback from the various constituencies who have already been affected by whatever has been out there, right? So it sounds perhaps a little trite, but it is important that you have people who are on the front lines of those constituencies, customers, shareholders, regulators, political leaders, and the employees. And you're getting real-time feedback from them about issues that are arising, about people's reactions to how the crisis is unfolding and how your CEO, your company is reacting to it. You need that real-time feedback through channels of information. And the truth is that very seldom does a company do that very well. Because what happens, at least in my experience, is people nod their heads and say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, we got to do that. And then they go out and do it for a couple of days, and then it begins to fall apart. People get a little complacent, a little bit lazy or whatever. But if you can keep those things in place, that's enormously helpful. Then you have an operations room where all that information is being fed in, and you got people there who are charged with gauging it and then preparing for scenarios and drafting documents on a continual basis to deal with the scenarios. That's one way of handling the situation. But that's a lot of theory, and in practice, there are some problems.
Nigel.
No, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
I think there's something to be said for the scenario planning element. And when somebody says, I work in crisis communications or crisis management, the usual response from somebody is, oh, you must love the adrenaline. And the answer is actually no. My job is to remove the adrenaline. I want everyone to be calm. I want everybody to know what's going on. I want to know what's happening. And to the emotional CEO, he or she, to be able to lay out, here's how this will look, and here's what will happen if we do this, and provide decisions and guide through that process. So I think there are certain things that an organisation should be prepared for, that every organisation should be prepared for, and then there are industry-specific ones that will make sense as well. And then there are the other things that just come from nowhere that you try to look for patterns and try and match quickly.
So there's one word that has been missing so far that is the intangible in every effective communicator, whether it's crisis or normal corporate communications, and that's a trust relationship with a reporter. And I cannot tell you, it's no different than in human relationships, that trust is the essential ingredient to being effective when you're in the middle of a crisis and you're dealing with a reporter, especially following my sometimes risky strategy of calling a reporter and giving the reporter the bad story, on the condition that I know the reporter, have worked with the reporter, trust the reporter, and the reporter trusts me to tell it all and not hold back any bad facts. Because by doing so, I get a chance to take our time, make sure the deadline isn't looming so an incomplete story will be written, and the reporter will give me my fair argument based on facts, sometimes called spin, which I hate that word. It's an argument based on facts. And if somebody on the other side is arguing that my company is bad, I want to be sure that the reporter gets all the facts, so I get my argument, and I negotiate high up in the story to get my argument done. But by taking that risk, it requires a reporter that you trust, which is to say, will write all the facts fairly, won't try to angle it or slant it against you, and you have to develop those relationships over the years.
It sounds like there's a lot of advanced work here. There's relationship building, there's scenario analysis. Let me ask a question about some of this advanced scenario analysis and kind of crisis management, confirming that it is possible that a law school professor is the best job ever. Several years ago, a group of us had a chance to work with one of the Bay Area tech companies, and it was the board and it was several senior executives, and a part of that was several hours of essentially brainstorming about emergent potential crises, right? Because in corporate governance,
That sounds like fun.
Yeah, it was actually fun, and let's just say it was a creative crowd. And from that came something that they internally refer to as the Big Black Book of Doom, right? Which is basically a list of everything they could come up with that could ever go wrong.
Don't be leaking that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, exactly. When you flip to it, it's like, alien invasion. Ooh, we have one like that. It's like, okay. And so it was a pretty rigorous exercise. It took up a lot of very senior people's time for ones that were identified or flagged as highly probable but just hard to predict when. Let's call it a massive earthquake, right? They invested time and resources to actually flesh out a whole plan, and then they do dry runs on some of the more likely ones. This is a lot of investment, and my question to you is, we preach this absolutely as a best practice from the corporate governance viewpoint. Is this a good investment? I mean, does this really pay off when it all goes boom and they pull out the Big Black Book of Doom, or do they even forget where they put it?
Well, from my perspective, I absolutely think it's a great investment, and that's not just because I draw my salary from doing that sort of thing. There is a real benefit in not doing the beta test during the actual crisis, to actually know who's meant to be at the table, know what conversations may come up, being able to know what role people are playing and how you might respond, and to have talked through that without a sense of emotion and pressure of the real-time situation. The other thing is that if you don't have the ability to put that sort of investment in place, having somebody who works with the organisation, an external advisor, somebody who knows your organisation, your ethics, your culture, to provide that sort of advice, that has had that sort of experience, that sort of investment may also be worth making.
So I think it's a terrific investment. And I think one of the problems in crisis management is when you're trying to think ahead about crises, or you see an issue emerging, is that the CEO or others will say, oh my God, don't engage in overkill, don't do all this paperwork, don't do all this thinking, meet and deliberate on it. There's no such thing as overkill when you're trying to prepare or think ahead about a potential existential crisis. It just isn't. And so, at least in the crisis communications arena, I think being nerdy is truly a virtue. In fact, in our firm, we used to say anality was a virtue, and it really is. So I think it's a terrific investment in the final analysis.
That's great.
The other thing that's really good, if people who have done this sort of work before start to recognise patterns. So even if you've got a topic in front of you you've never seen before, it looks like something else you've dealt with or prepared for. And it was about 4 or 5 years ago, the Icelandic volcano spread ash across Europe. We didn't have a volcanic ash situation in our Book of Doom, but we did have a terror attack, and many of the impacts associated with that in terms of transport, logistics, supply chain, travel, customer impacts and the rest matched that sort of scenario. So having thought through a scenario of one sort may be able to be applied in another way.
There was a defense secretary that once said, unknown unknowns are the scariest piece of the story. But in this exercise, developing the Big Black of Doom, a very clever executive said, if you go through enough known unknowns and you have a bunch of them, when the unknown unknown shows up, you can cut and paste and figure out maybe how to deal with it, which I thought was very interesting. Lanny, it looked like you wanted to add to that, please.
Well, there's a slightly different twist that comes from a case study that I can name because I wrote about it, and that is what happened at Penn State and Joe Paterno. And this was a Book of Doom scenario that you could never anticipate. There were so many variables. When human elements enter into a crisis, there's no rule book you can follow. And here was this great, great man, the icon within the Penn State community, Joe Paterno, football coach, great, great man, who had a blind spot, which was his football program and an incident involving a coach raping a young boy. And he thought it was his responsibility to report that when he heard about it, and then for 10 years remained silent about it while it continued. And the crisis occurred when the board realized that he had been at least silent, complicit participant. He certainly knew that he had missed doing something because his dying words literally was, "I should have done more." Now, faced with that situation, I was the second or third two large public relations firms preceded me, and I came in as basically a sole practitioner. What do you do when you have the alumni community outraged at the replacement of this hero with very little information to explain why the board did it? Why was there so little information? First of all, there was the human element. Joe Paterno was dying of cancer. There's no rule book to deal with blaming a man who's dying of cancer for not catching this earlier. Secondly, were the lawyers who were worried, for good reason, about all the children that had been raped suing the university. And I literally participated in a meeting where lawyers were thinking of using the statute of limitations as a defense that the children hadn't come forward within the statute of limitations. And I said within the room, does anybody in this room want to be in the headline that you're saying a child that has been raped can't sue Penn State because of the statute of limitations? Really? You want your name in that headline? But that was the legal view. And then finally, to answer the problem required the board to explain why this was allowed to happen and why they decided to replace Joe Paterno. Well, that's just crying with legal danger because the board isn't supposed to have not known or allowed it to happen. So the way I solved it, with a lot of very good tension, engagement, debate with the legal team, was to have each board member in a room with a reporter from the New York Times that I trusted to follow the ground rules. And the ground rules were every member of the board could speak on the record with a tape recorder as long as the board was describing feelings of what they went through to fire their hero. Every one of the board members had known and loved Joe Paterno for years. So the story was not about the legal issue of liability, and it wasn't about the decision to replace Joe Paterno because of the issue of Sandusky and child rape. What the story was about was emotion. The wrenching, gut-wrenching decision each board member personally described going around the table when they made the decision to replace Joe Paterno. And the key quote that when I heard in tears one of the board members say was, "It came down to my love for Joe Paterno and the children. And I kissed my son, 10 years old, goodnight the night before we made the decision, and it made up my mind." And I knew there was my story. So there's no rule book that could have figured that. I didn't figure that out ahead of time. I didn't really see what the solution was people telling their personal, emotional, human stories about a gut-wrenching decision. And that was a solution I never could have foreseen if I had planned it in every doomed book. It just happened because I allowed the human emotions to dominate the story rather than my usual mantra of facts, facts, facts.
Let me ask a question a little bit related to that highlights the millennial shift of how stuff is consumed. That story sounds like, in part, it works because the target alum that was both moneyed and dedicated and powerful in that story was probably above a certain age. I don't know what it was, but let's call it 50, right? And is probably a pretty aggressive consumer of media that is like the New York Times. And so that trusted relationship had all this firepower. And yet, if you let's transition to the Bay Area and assume that the customer base is younger and the relevant parties are younger, the employees are younger, call it on average well under 30. Even if you have that great relationship with New York Times, my observation of my students anyway, when I teach finance, like, who's read the Wall Street Journal today? No hands go up. Who's read the New York Times? And it turns out that they're consuming news from Twitter, Facebook, yeah. And so it feels like there isn't the big gun available for powering through a story. Is there something that is an equivalent? Maybe it's harder to put together in the under 30 crowd that consumes information in such a different way, where it would have been, I think it might have been harder to put together the story that Lanny just told.
Well, Kleiner Perkins, the venture capital firm, was my client until I left 6 weeks ago to join Square. And I was working with Kleiner on the Ellen Pao trial. So I was in court every day. And it was really interesting because we saw 30 reporters in court almost every day for 6 weeks, every day, there before the doors open, stayed until the end. Even when the jury was dismissed, the journalists stayed and listened to everything the judge had to say about different evidentiary motions, et cetera. TechCrunch for that trial, I saw like 10 neighbors of mine. I mean, literally, I was like, what are you doing here? I'm working, and it turns out they just wanted to come and see the trial. I thought it was funny. But TechCrunch, for example, was TechCrunch had 2 to 3 reporters in court every day, and live blogged. So every word on most days that was said in court, when there was any witness of interest, it was all live blogged out. And then The Guardian and The Telegraph and German papers and papers around the world picked up on that live blog, and they reported on it. And it was interesting for us as the PR people, because our job was really to, tech reporters don't know about the legal process, so really to answer questions about the legal process, what would come next, why plaintiffs present their case first, et cetera, what this motion meant, what this, timing of things, and then really to correct a lot of the things, because they would get things wrong. I mean, even though they were there in court, they would be doing it so quickly, things would be wrong. And we realized pretty soon that it would be amplified everywhere and it would be tweeted out, a million times, and there would be debates on Twitter and from random people all over the world talking about this. And so we really wanted to make sure that what was said in court was actually portrayed correctly. So I don't know if there is one, but I will tell you for a big event of public interest, they go to Twitter. People go to Twitter. I was the NCAA was a client of mine, and same thing in trial the year before. 6 weeks of trial in federal court. Sports journalists were there, 30 every day, and with cameras. And it was a name, image, likeness trial. It was a class action lawsuit by Ed O'Bannon, and it was just people went to Twitter and got all their news there, and we saw it even more this year in Ellen Powell. So,
Nigel, anybody want to?
Well, I think the interpretation point is a really interesting one. If we're talking about a particular lawsuit as the subject of whatever the crisis or issue may be, there are journalists who just need to write quickly, who'll pick something up, who'll put it out there and don't want to understand the full context. And yet there are others, and some of the more reputable organisations that will want to get into the detail, are willing to have a brief with you to understand what's actually important. And particularly if you're a large corporate, the ability to know who's the winner and who's the loser in the situation is really what the first story is about. And something small that happens that's marginal, that is not at all important from the lawyer's point of view, can become the big story on the next day. So litigation folks these days in particular are more attuned to that and the extent to which something that happens in court may become news and can actually influence it as well. So,
And Lanny's story reminds me of the power of, this has become almost a cliche, but the power of a narrative.
Yep.
And there's been a lot of psychological testing and neuroscience testing, behavioral economics testing of the power of narratives. Like that? So I would tend to think that even in Silicon Valley, people might like a good narrative, right? It's possible. I mean, everybody's still human. And so it comes back to the question or the issue I mentioned earlier of precision. So you have to be precise about the message or the narrative you're shaping for your particular audience, and also the medium that you're using. Understanding what is the most important medium for your audience. So you're targeting the narrative, both in its message and in its distribution channel, to the audience that you have. So I think it is relevant to Silicon Valley. And this even gets down, this is why it's so exciting nowadays and interesting. A good example, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of, well, this term curator is going around a lot. How are narratives and facts curated for the new media, for something like paper or inside or mobile devices, right? People like us are going to pay attention to that sort of issue. That's part of the precision, part of the targeting that's going to be critical.
Could I just take issue?
Absolutely.
Since I'm on the upper side of 50, but I also am blessed with a second generation of children, 17 and 10, so I'm able to see it. I think it's a mistake on both sides of the divide to underestimate the power of the New York Times influencing Twitter, influencing social media, and spreading virally around the world. And it's also a terrible mistake to focus on the traditional media and forget about what's going on social media. And I advise clients, as somebody who can say I have older children, grandchildren, and younger children, which is a whole nother narrative that my wonderful wife sitting over there is the mother of our two younger children. is that you've got to know both and decide which to emphasize and which audience you're looking for. So it really requires both.
Well, a recent example, the New York Times story by David Treitfeld about Amazon and its work culture, I mean, that went viral in Silicon Valley, was a huge topic of conversation, Twitter, and everyone I know, including millennials, read that story.
And the subsequent stories about whether the response from Toni
exactly.
was the right response.
That was good fodder for days and weeks.
Oh, yeah, the PR folks loved it.
In the financial press, we, in the corporate government side, we worry a little bit about algorithmic automated reporting. And so the New York Times and the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal serve as primary sources for bots that pick up and reword and piece together and blast stuff out. I think that's a very good point and relevant. We have a few more minutes before I want to switch to open-ended questions because we have to end by 7 o'clock. But I want to ask a question related to something that you've each said in different ways, and that is you have to eliminate the siloing. You got to get in front of it. You got to have someone that brings everyone to the table so you can act on the advice you've given. And yet there is a particular type of crisis that seems to make that extra hard, and that is the crisis that impacts the CEO. So oftentimes, one person who can really de-silo and take charge and hire the firm and get the lawyers and bash lawyers and communications people's heads together if need be is probably the CEO. But I don't know what the ratio is, but we know it's a double-digit percentage. A lot of crises are about the CEO, which kind of, not always, takes the CEO out of play. So what's the strategy then to try to engage this de-siloing everyone at the table approach if your CEO has been taken out of play?
Well, let me jump in and put it to Nigel. Who's my client if, God forbid, your CEO has a personal scandal and he calls me, or she, and says, I've got a personal scandal, what do I do? It's going to cause the stock to go down, the board may fire me, what do I do? Now, who's my client? If the company is hiring me, he's not or she's not my client. There is a conflict. And the way I've dealt with it is, if you want to hire me, it's your personal funds. Wall me off from your board and from your company. I'm representing you. Or else stop talking. And I said this to a certain very famous female client whose company carried her name. Who's my client? And her name, I wrote about this, was Martha Stewart. And I said to Martha, who am I representing? Your board is not happy with you. There are people in your management not happy with you, and yet I can't represent you and Martha Stewart Inc., even though it's unusual, it's her company. So that is one of the instances where the CEO being in trouble creates a huge problem for a lawyer and a crisis manager.
Sure. What other thoughts?
The way to get around to deal with the issues you talked about, banging heads together and all that, obviously. I agree with everything that Lanny said about getting involved with the CEO. But the way to get around it is you get hired by the board. If you get hired by the CEO in that kind of situation, you can't really help the company, even though you're not being hired by the company, because the board is taking over. Even if the CEO is still there, the board is taking over, and you wind up working with the board, which is actually where you want to be if you want to have an impact on the organization. And at least that's been my experience.
We have a question, other category, which is regional differences. We've hinted at them a little bit, but it's not just age, it's not just technology versus old school industrial. I think there are regional differences, arguably, about how crises spread, magnify, how you should respond. So first, is that true in your opinion? And if so, what do you think the differences are? Can I start with you, Lin-Hua?
I'm going to punt this one to Nigel.
Okay.
So I absolutely agree that there are differences, and that just as there are many different cultures and many different people around the world, so too are the environment that you'll be dealing with. Media relations in China is very different to media relations in the United States, just for example. So as a PR person, there are certain media outlets in China that are government-sponsored, government-owned, and you pay a lot of attention to those because that's usually the voice of the government that's involved. There are other occasions, other media outlets around them that are amplifying what they think the government wants to see and wants to hear. So I think there are absolutely geopolitical and cultural aspects to certain topics that you need to be thinking about. I also think that there are certain topics that are easier to discuss in some environments than others because of historical norms or mores of a particular situation as well. So in Europe, privacy is a very different conversation than here in the United States. And something that's, unless you have somebody locally who understands and appreciates the environment you're in and can represent the audience to the decision makers, you may totally miss the crisis that's going on because you don't understand that local environment.
Here in Silicon Valley, diversity is a huge theme, and it has been for a couple of years now, and I think that it is not limited to here, but certainly, during the summer when tech companies release their diversity numbers, et cetera, it's really a much bigger theme here, I think, than around the country. And I do think the ground rules dealing with European reporters versus Chinese reporters, and it's, they don't have people. You can't deal with a German reporter for the FT, even if you're speaking English the same way you would with a U.S. reporter, because there's just different ideas of what off-the-record on background and embargo, whether that's even possible in different countries.
Okay. Before I ask our last question and switch to questions, highlight for students. Students are often shy about jumping up and asking questions. Then afterwards they come up and say, oh, I wished I asked a question. So I'm giving you your 3-minute warning now. Start thinking of your question and get ready to ask it. We will give preference to students and then to fellows and faculty, then to academic staff in no particular order, and then, of course, anyone can ask questions. But I just want to make sure we get the students a chance to ask questions. So my last question before we switch to that. During our conversations, we kept talking about how to keep senior executives of the board from just going off the rails, right? From panicking, running, screaming from the building, calling their own lawyers, just everything going boom. Are there some practical suggestions you have beyond what we've heard already, which is to have planned in advance, to have a strong leader and de-silo? But are there just things you've done that helped keep executives in their seat and not disclose too much information before they really got a grasp of it, or apologize insincerely without a fix? What do you do, as a management strategy for these executives that, for them, and having been on the CEO side once upon a time, it feels like your world's ending, right? If it's your own company or if you're the CEO, it's just a terrible place to be at the other end of a crisis. What do you do to keep them on the rails?
Well, I've had some experience with this, and I think there's a personal relationship. I use that about the media, but your relationship with your client. It's a calming effect that almost is never an exception if your client thinks you're ready to fight. And that means being on the record in public, if necessary, quoted in a paper or going on television. Having somebody fight for you is a calming effect for someone in crisis. People who are running for cover and don't want to be out there and take the risk of defending somebody who may turn out to be wrong increases anxiety in life as well as in a company. So I am of a nature of fighting for something I believe in. I can't make it up. If I don't believe I'm getting all the facts, I can't do it. But if I actually believe that I've got good facts, they're not always good, but I'm able to make a fight based on the facts, I find it's easier to calm the client down.
I totally agree with that. You've got to show that you want to fight for the client. It's also important, this is a very soft area, but to get a read of the client's persona and see what the temperament is. In addition, because they have widely varying temperaments, to say the least.
And temper.
And tempers, yes. But I think you have to show that you're steadfast even when the person blows up at you, right? That you hang in there. And this is really tough to do, at least for me, given my personality. You have to be willing to push back hard when you know the guy is wrong or the woman is wrong, and because actually you get respect for that. I've run into any number of really tough-minded, scorched earth kinds of CEOs who actually, in the final analysis, are not necessarily that way with you if you stand up to them. If you cave, then they kind of lose respect for you, I think, and they go off and do whatever they want to do. But if you stand up to them, there's a different attitude going forward. And you give them your best advice.
No.
I think it's the relationship, the experience, and the intelligence they believe you have as an advisor, but also that you are telling them to calm down for the right reasons, not because you are not willing or you're afraid to fight and be aggressive, but that this is actually the right way to do it. So I think it's really a combination of what Walter and Lanny said is if they believe you're saying calm down because you don't have the guts or you don't have the wherewithal to go out and fight for them, they won't respect that. But they want to know you'll be able to do it when push comes to shove, but you're making this decision or you're giving this advice based on your best judgment.
Nigel, you get last word if you like.
Thank you very much. No, I think everyone else has given the best answer, so I'm going to give a slightly cynical one, and that is to give them something to do. More often than not, you've got senior executives who are A-type personalities who have a bias to action who just want to get something done. If you're focused on media, on customer communications, on employees, if you're working on all those because they're the priority audiences and they're not feeling involved, engaged, helping with the scenarios and what's happening next, then you risk them running off the rails. So for me, I think all of these things that my learned colleagues have said is absolutely important, but involving them in the process and what happens next is also important.
I like that. Bias to action. They're going to be running one way or another. Just point them.
Point them in the right direction.
I like that. Well, with that, let's go ahead and switch to questions. As I mentioned, students, be strong. Good. Yay. We have students standing up. Make sure you walk up to your microphones. And, of course, anyone else can ask questions, too. But I just want to give the students a chance, perhaps, to ask first.
This is such an interesting topic, and I was just writing out all of my thoughts and comments, and it was just exploding. I'm going to read some of my thoughts and then limit myself to 3 questions, if that's okay.
Do 2.
Okay, 2.
And then you can come back up.
Okay. The Volkswagen crisis management, and then Berlin, the Syria refugee crisis, the Stanford Business School crisis, short attack, isn't it too late? The damage is already been done. The Amazon New York Times article, Hillary's emails, Donald Trump facts. He's just saying stuff loudly, and he has influence. People are. It's interesting.
Growth industry.
Theranos.
It's huge.
A lot of things going on. 2 questions. You mentioned the example of the shortstop. By then, it's too late. So even if we do an apology and it's incredibly precise and all that good stuff, and we say we have a fix or whatever, the stock's already plunged. People have lost confidence, and trust takes years to build. It feels like it's too late, and it's like a losing battle. There's nothing you can do, really. That's what it feels like. But if you have great counterexamples, that would be awesome.
So let's pause there. Let's get a little answer, and then we can have you come back to this.
Quick answer. The way to defeat a short seller is not to attribute bad motives and say, oh, you're only doing it to make money, because that's changing the subject, and that doesn't instill confidence. So the subject is the short right or wrong, not is he going to make money by putting out bad information. So you've got to get your facts to prove that the short is wrong. If the short is right, then you have to get the company to fix the problem. In this case, I only love to tell stories with good endings and not bad ones. From yesterday's press conference, the stock has come back 33.33% as of today. So that's in one day, it's back up a third. So sometimes if you're lucky and you have the facts and you can prove the short is wrong, you will get a restoration of something that you were looking for. Now, we'll see what tomorrow brings, but so far, so good.
Walter, yeah, that leaning forward, I have.
Well, I agree with that. You can counter it. The stock can come back up. But this is where the issue of third-party commentators comes in too, because what you can do is you can get certain analysts, credible analysts, securities analysts, to speak out and say this is all nonsense, right? Which helps immensely in terms of not just reputation but the facts.
Second question.
Not sure how relevant it is because this is corporate governance, but so the the Syrian refugee crisis, Germany, at least Angela Merkel, made an announcement saying that I'm going to simplify this grossly, that we're welcoming 800,000 refugees and so on. And then that pressurizes France and other countries to reciprocate and do something similar. Is there a role for lawyers or PR people to help her craft that message such that refugees need help, absolutely, but the whole world is listening, and whomever needs help and is fighting a battle in their home country is thinking this is an awesome opportunity for me to go to a great country where, there's like 1 year maternity leave and things along those lines. Is there even a role here for lawyers? Or is this too massive a problem that it's really up to, dare I say, the politicians?
Great question, and let me add a little twist to it because I'd like to add, one of the points here is this is in some ways a very slow-moving crisis, right? It goes on, and then it has a political component with counterparties that you want to do things. So part of managing the crisis is maybe inducing France to do something because you've done something. So there's several components of that. Could you maybe answer that in, big picture, but also tactical way? It's so slow, and you're trying to induce other behaviors.
I haven't advised country leaders, so I don't have that sort of experience to draw on, but what you're describing in the situation is a demonstration of leadership. There's something that is core to the country and the position you want to put out to the rest of the world. So I think that's something that a CEO can really understand the culture of the company and put that out and say, this is our statement and this is what. And I think the diversity example in Silicon Valley is a good one of those where certain companies have been very vocal in what they've done and what sort of statements they've put out. So to the question of whether or not lawyers should be involved, they'll always be. Where you need a PR person, you need a comms person, and usually vice versa.
And I think what you're talking about is also a campaign, which is a little different for them than a crisis. But I think everyone up here has probably worked on different campaigns and inducing others. It reminds me of the billionaire pledge that maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, where there was a lot of press on that. I mean, you can definitely imagine how PR would be very helpful by working with reporters from around the world, in your example, to ask the questions, why is Germany doing this and other countries not, and helping put that pressure on. So, I think there's definitely a role for public relations and communications where anytime you have an objective, whether it's to try to bring people on board, to try to get people to see your way in politics, in corporate governance, in a consumer fad, there's always room for a campaign. And I think, obviously I work in the industry, but I think there's room, there's ways that PR people can help.
Thank you. If there's time at the end, you can ask another question. We'll go to this question.
I teach sports management in the business school here. What's the best example of a league handling a crisis, and what's the worst example, and reasons why?
Whoever would like to.
Are you looking for an American sports example? Because I'm an 8-year-old in American terms, so.
I think the NFL, is a recent terrible example of how they've handled all the spousal abuse and sex discrimination, and that the whole, and I'm forgetting the player's name, but the elevator video, claiming they didn't see it. I think that was just a total disaster. So best example, I can't really think of one right now.
That's probably a good sign.
Yeah.
Because it faded from your memory, right?
Exactly.
I can think of one, and at the risk of having people go look at a lot of Australian newspapers, there was the Australian Football League. There was an example of one particular player of Indigenous Aboriginal descent who was being booed by competitors. And I saw the AFL, the Australian Football League, come out very strongly in terms of a statement of support for that individual. They worked with clubs to create a social media awareness of the topic in terms of actually dealing with things very well. It turned a conversation that if you were involved in this sort of behaviour, it made it antisocial, and as it should be, but it called out racism for what it was. And I think that was from the outside in, again, I don't know all the facts, but from the outside in, it looked to me to be a very effective way to manage a very challenging topic that, to be honest, the league had been accused of not handling well previously.
Let me give a quick case study of when it was done well by the Professional Golfers Association, the PGA. Without mentioning names, but you can figure it out on Google. One professional golfer, young but had won several tournaments, discovered that by accident he'd used a performance-enhancing drug, which he knew violated a major rule of the PGA. And he self-reported. In golf, if you happen to touch a ball by accident, you are required to tell the people you're playing against for money that you did that and charge yourself a stroke. It's a tradition in golf, and it's a very proud tradition. When I got the call from this professional golfer, I said, you self-reported, what's the PGA going to do? Well, they're going to announce that they're suspending me for X number of months for using performance-enhancing drugs. And I said, well, then you're going to be lumped together with all the steroid and all the other doping issues in bicycling and every other sport. And that's the way you're labeled for the rest of your life. He said, what would you suggest? Because the PGA said they're going to suspend me and they're going to make a public announcement. I said, why don't we try to call the head of the PGA, somebody I knew from way back when in politics, and let's see whether we can do this together and make it a teaching moment for the rest of professional golf. Remember, golf is not a team sport, it's individual. A lot of these golfers don't get together and learn what is a performance-enhancing drug and what isn't. Let's do it together. So rather than adversarial, I called the PGA, a very wise and crisis management educated general counsel got on the telephone, I think knew of me, and I said, how do we do this together? Well, his first response was, we're going to crack him hard, we're going to make an example out of him, and I said, so there's a winner and a loser if you do that. How do we do this win-win? Let's tell the story of golf. The tradition of self-reporting is what makes golf a unique sport, because it isn't always the case. And so we wrote the story together, the PGA and this golfer and me, and we put a statement out together that the golfer, telling the truth, went to the PGA. He blamed himself for doing something by not being educated about this particular substance. He took the blame. The PGA praised him for self-reporting, and collectively we put the story out, but went to a reporter who covered golf, also had a television show, and wrote the story completely at the same moment the PGA and we put our statement out. So the statement is put out, and people immediately on Twitter and all over social media are reading the story written by a sports reporter. That combination wasn't a great experience for the golfer, but he was praised by then the mainstream Sports Illustrated, ESPN, all praised the golfer for setting a good example, praised PGA for being fair to the golfer and not demonizing him. And it wasn't a great experience for the golfer, but it was a collaborative exercise.
Walter, real quick, and then we'll...
Yeah, there aren't many positive examples in sports, I think, and I do a lot of sports work, but I think this is a self-absorbed example because I worked on this, but I think that ultimately the Clippers situation got under control, mainly because my client, Dick Parsons, came in with the right persona and so forth, but there was a certain amount of messaging around that, and that got under control and turned out reasonably well, I think.
You know, I just have to say, every time Walter tells me how, and absolutely been an admirer of his over the years, first he tells me David Boies was the guy he worked with, the best in the business. Then he says Dick Parsons. So you are a lucky man.
These guys don't need PR.
Question here.
This is a question it's a hypothetical question. I'm imagining this post-media world. And for Walter, because he's so hip to a paper and inside, will it be 2 years from now or 10 years from now when a corporation breaks their own crisis on Medium, live blogs their own trial, and takes control of their own social media and breaks their own crisis going around the journalists? For instance, Jay Carney could have interviewed with the Financial Times. He went on Medium. Now, I know my kids, they don't make a distinction between Medium and the New York Times. So what's this world like in 5 years?
I'd like to start that one.
Well,
Nigel.
at the risk of not being political, and I can't vote in this country, there are some that say that the White House is actually doing that very effectively. Yes, they have the press pool, and yes, they have direct engagement with the press, but there is also an official photographer, an official YouTube feed. There are the White House blogs. There are a variety of social media channels. There is an organisation that is dealing directly with the press, but also directly with the broader populace. And I don't think that's a crisis example necessarily, but it's certainly one that speaks to a model where an organisation could do that.
Walter, how about your view?
there could be a lot of that. Maybe I'm just being old-fashioned here, but I think the problem with that is they can't just take it over because it wouldn't be credible. And people are going to still want, I hope, credible outside observers and critics. You can have more of what you're talking about and what Nigel's talking about, but it's sort of hard to envision a world in which there are not more or less independent critics.
Can I ask a follow-up is, do you think the millennials and are we calling them Zs? That's what I heard yesterday, the Zs, my kids, right? Will they learn that? Will they learn this? Because, my experience is similar. There's a very modest sense of distinction between the New York Times. They laugh every time I go outside in the cold and bring in these things that I put on the table. So
12 hours ago, yeah.
Is that a learning curve?
No, but I have to say, I'm sorry, am I talking too much now?
Nope. No.
This goes back to a point that Lanny had, though. I mean, the New York Times continues to be important, but the issue is, as I understand it, not being a cool person at all, is how this stuff gets aggregated and curated on, in particular, on mobile devices in the final analysis. So it can still have an impact. Your son might not know it's the New York Times, but that doesn't matter. The New York Times still influenced the aggregator or that curator. And you got to understand how that stuff is being curated too. What's placed where, what that means, how you write a story, how you develop a narrative. All that stuff is going to have it's already having a big impact.
But if the thrust of your question was the word control, take control, I think I preached that earlier, that the more a individual, company, politician can take control of the bad story and get the facts out him or herself or itself and not depend upon social media or traditional media to do it and then react to it, the better the company would be.
Since you have that student look about you, I'm going to ask the last question, and we'll make it quick.
So my question's about working in a crisis situation in which you're working with a company or you're working with individuals who kind of end up acting as loose cannons. What's a good strategy for managing a situation where you've got, even despite informing them that facts are very important, where people are playing fast and loose with facts, or they're getting a bit creative in what they're doing, and perhaps they're not consulting with legal teams to figure out why what they're doing is incorrect. What's kind of a strategy for minimizing the harm from that or getting that under control?
Good last question.
I'll take the first crack. I mean, I think it comes a lot down to preparation. So most companies that I know and ones that have dealt with scenario planning and thought about a crisis situation, and even those who don't plan for crises have a media policy, right? So everyone should know at a company that you're not allowed to speak to the press unless it's pre-approved by legal or the comms folks, the communications people. So most companies that I've seen and where I've worked have a policy that you can't just go off the rails and speak to press about whatever you want. There's avenues through which you do that, and you have to get approval. So that's one way. And I think in a crisis situation, if you have people, employees tweeting things out or saying things, people monitor it and they get in trouble, essentially. You just have to clamp down on it. And if they're senior leaders, they should frankly know better. And I think it's just really instilling and reminding everyone that the person who speaks to the press are these 3 people or these 5 people. And if you get an inquiry, you need to just forward that along and not talk about this and really lay out the rules. And if you see someone breaking those rules, you need to clamp down. And that happens, in my experience, it happens all the time, where in a situation there is an employee or someone in another office abroad or somewhere who didn't quite get the message, and you just have to be aware of everything and monitor it and stop them.
Yeah. One of the phrases we've used internally where somebody has been speaking on things that they don't know enough about, we often use the phrase, there is absolutely freedom of speech, but there is no freedom from consequence. And I think that there are examples where there are policies involved where you can talk, and there are sanctions potentially involved in terms of employment as well. But the reality is, if somebody wants to continue as a company, as an individual, they can continue to do what they like, usually with added credibility if they're an employee. So I think that's something that needs to be recognised. And if you're not taking control and being active in the conversation, then you allow that person with added credibility to continue to drive the story.
I think we're going to stop there and thank Lin-Hua, Walter, Nigel, and Lanny very much for your time. Please give them a round of applause.